They say a quiet woman hides the loudest storms. I suppose I became one without knowing when. My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and I have lived a life that from the outside might seem ordinary. A modest house in the suburbs, a garden where lilies grew like memories, and a marriage that lasted more than 3 decades. But like most things that endure, it endured because of silence, not because of joy. He was charming, that much was undeniable. Robert had the kind of smile that drew people to him, a man made of confidence and curated kindness. In our early days, I mistook his presence for love. I was young, full of hopeful illusions, and eager to believe that a man like him could truly see a woman like me. Still, I stayed, not out of weakness, but for our son, Matthew. I wanted him to grow up with the image of a whole family, even if the foundations were already fractured. I gave him birthdays filled with laughter, Christmas mornings that shimmered with warmth, and quiet evenings where I read him stories by the fire. I gave him the childhood I never had. Robert rarely noticed, or perhaps he did and simply didn't care. He was more interested in the world outside our walls. His career flourished. I watched as he climbed the ladders of success while I folded his shirts and buried my poetry in drawers he never opened. He died suddenly. A heart attack, they said. The kind that left no room for goodbyes, no time for reckoning. He collapsed in the office of his firm, surrounded by assistants in silent shock. The funeral came quickly, a blur of black suits and condolences I didn't want. Matthew stood beside me, tall now, and quiet in a way that reminded me too much of myself. After the funeral, the house became a cavern. Everything echoed. My grief was not for the man, but for the years lost to pretending. I mourned the woman I could have become. I mourned the words I never spoke. And then a package arrived. It was left on the porch, wrapped in brown paper, with my name written in delicate handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a small velvet box and a letter. The handwriting matched. No return address. No explanation beyond the first line. He was never mine, not really, but I loved him as if he were. I sat at the edge of my bed with the letter resting in my lap, afraid to unfold it. The room smelled faintly of jasmine, my own perfume, one I hadn't worn in weeks. Something about grief dulls the senses. Even fragrance, once familiar, becomes foreign when the soul has gone silent. I remember staring at the handwriting. It was graceful, careful, almost old-fashioned. A woman who still wrote by hand in this age of messages and phones. A woman who chose to send something with weight, as though paper could carry more truth than technology. She was not careless, whoever she was. I opened the letter slowly, the paper crackling like dry leaves in autumn, and I read, "Dear Eleanor, I never imagined I would write to you, much less like this. Perhaps I should have left you in peace, but peace has never followed me where he was concerned. I met Robert 10 years ago at a charity gala. I was not his secretary, nor his assistant, nor some accidental passerby. I was a curator at the museum where the event was held. He noticed me before I noticed him. I suppose that's how he always began. He told me he was married. He didn't hide it, but he said your marriage was more companionship than love. He said you were distant, unreachable. I believed him because I wanted to. It was never meant to be an affair. It began as conversation, long walks after exhibitions, shared coffee between meetings. I convinced myself it was harmless, but one night turned into many, and before I knew it, I was part of a life I never belonged to. He told me about your son. He said he admired your devotion to Matthew. He spoke of your strength, though never in front of me. Only in quieter moments when guilt seemed to take hold. I think he respected you in his way, but he didn't know how to love you. I didn't come between you. I want you to know that. He was already gone from you long before I arrived. That doesn't make my choices right. I just need you to understand that I didn't steal him. I simply accepted the pieces he offered. He gave me this necklace. He said it reminded him of the ocean, the way it always returned to shore no matter how far it went. He said he saw that in you. I didn't understand then. I do now. He loved you, in his flawed, faltering way. I stopped reading. My hands trembled. I looked at the velvet box again. Inside was a delicate silver chain with a small aquamarine stone. It glimmered faintly in the lamplight like water beneath a winter sun. I didn't cry, not because I wasn't hurt, but because something deeper held me. The kind of pain that doesn't need tears to validate its existence. It just sits inside you, quietly shifting the weight of who you thought you were. I kept reading. The day he died, he was on his way to see you. He had written you a letter, a real one. I don't know if you ever received it. He said he was tired of the lies. He said he wanted to come home. He never made it. I hope this necklace brings you something gentle, not forgiveness. I don't deserve that, but perhaps clarity, perhaps release. With remorse. Anna Mitchell. Her name meant nothing to me. We had never met. I had never heard of her, but her words cut like truth, soft, deliberate, and undeniable. That night I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, the necklace in my hand, and watched the darkness breathe. I thought about all the times I had chosen silence, all the ways I had shrunk myself for the sake of image, for the sake of keeping something that was already broken. I realized I wasn't angry with Anna. I wasn't even angry with Robert. I was angry with myself for abandoning the woman I could have become, for exchanging voice for peace and truth for routine. But as dawn crept across the sky, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: stillness. Not the emptiness of grief, but the calm that follows after letting go. The days after the letter passed not as hours or minutes, but as a quiet suspension of movement. I did not call anyone. I did not tell Matthew. I watered the garden more often than needed and stood for long moments among the lilies, watching their stems shift in the wind like fragile truths. Some petals had begun to fall, brushing the soil like small farewells. I envied them. They knew how to let go. I placed the necklace in the drawer where I kept old photographs and broken pens, things that once meant something, or still did, in ways I couldn't name. And yet, that drawer became something else after that day. It wasn't clutter anymore. It was memory. I found myself reaching for that letter more often than I admitted. I would unfold it carefully, rereading a line or two, never the entire thing. Her voice, Anna's voice, had become strangely familiar, not because I trusted her, but because her words aligned with shadows I had refused to name. There was a photograph tucked inside the envelope I hadn't noticed before. It was hidden, folded tightly between the pages. In it, Robert stood beside her on a beach. He wore his linen shirt, the one I had given him on our 20th anniversary. His arm was around her, but his face looked tired. Not unhappy, but worn, as though even in joy something inside him sagged. I did not tear it, I did not burn it. I placed it beside the letter. For weeks I drifted. I went through routines with measured grace, grocery lists, sweeping the porch, feeding the neighbor's cat while she was away. On the outside, I remained the composed widow. On the inside, I was sifting through ash for a spark that could still warm me. One afternoon, while organizing the attic, more out of restlessness than necessity, I came across a box I hadn't seen in years. It was marked in Robert's handwriting, Eleanor's writings. My breath caught. I had forgotten about it, or more truthfully, I had made myself forget. In our early years, I used to write poems and essays. I never published anything. Robert had found one once lying open on the kitchen table. He read it in silence, then folded it and said almost absent-mindedly that I had a gift, but it wouldn't pay bills. That moment, that one comment had been enough. I stopped sharing. I stopped writing. But he hadn't thrown them away. They were all here, neatly stacked, yellowing pages filled with my own voice, the younger version of me that still believed she could shape the world with words. I sat on the floor of the attic and read until twilight climbed the walls. The dust clung to my skin, but I didn't care. That night I wrote again. It came slowly at first, a paragraph, a page, then another. I wasn't writing for anyone. I was simply listening to myself after years of silence. I poured the confusion, the pain, the dull ache of betrayal not into accusation but into observation. My words held no venom, only weight and clarity. Each night became a return. The soft scratching of the pen on paper, the lamp casting a gold halo over the desk, and the steady breath of an old woman finding her way back to herself. Weeks later, Matthew visited. He had become a man I hardly recognized, taller than his father but gentler. He had inherited Robert's eyes but not his silence. That comforted me more than he knew. He noticed the letter, left by accident on the kitchen table. His eyes narrowed as he picked it up. I didn't stop him. He read without asking permission, and I let him. When he finished, he stood quietly. Then he asked if I hated his father. I remember replying, no, but I grieved him long before he died. Matthew didn't speak. He simply embraced me. And for the first time in years, I felt a mother's worth not defined by sacrifice, but by presence. Later that evening, he asked if he could read my writing. I hesitated but nodded. I gave him a few pages. He stayed up late, sitting on the porch wrapped in an old blanket, the soft thrum of cicadas echoing around him. The next morning, he told me, "You still have a voice, Mom. Maybe it's time the world heard it." It was the kindest thing anyone had said to me in decades. I didn't rush. Healing doesn't come with urgency. I continued writing. I mailed a few essays to small journals. A few were rejected. One was published. The day I held the printed magazine in my hand, I didn't weep. I simply smiled because a door long closed had finally opened. Over time, writing became more than a refuge. It became a restoration. I wrote of gardens and silence, of longing and discovery. I wrote of the shadows women live with and the light we sometimes forget we can carry. Months passed, my porch filled with drafts and teacups, the breeze always tugging at pages like curious fingers. Occasionally, a neighbor would stop to ask how I was doing. I gave them the usual polite words. None of them knew about Anna, or the letter, or the photograph. It wasn't their burden. I never reached out to Anna. There was no need. Her letter had served its purpose. She had given me truth, however painful. That was her offering, and I had accepted it. But I did write her name once. On the last page of a journal, nothing more. Just her name in my own handwriting, and beneath it, a single line. Some stories are gifts, even when wrapped in grief. One evening, as winter approached, Matthew returned again. He brought with him a small box. Inside was a printed manuscript, my essays bound together. He had titled it Lilies in the Wind. He said he had submitted it to a publisher who specialized in women's voices from overlooked lives. They had accepted it. I sat with that book in my lap for hours, afraid to open it. Not because I doubted the words inside, but because it meant the world had changed while I had been still, and somehow I had changed with it. That night I lit a candle, held the necklace Robert once gave to another woman, and placed it beside the book. I did not feel bitterness. I felt completion. Grief, I've learned, doesn't always ask for revenge. Sometimes it asks only for recognition. There are moments in life when time does not pass, it echoes. In the months that followed the publication of Lilies in the Wind, I found myself moving not forward but deeper, into memory, into meaning, into the quiet corners I had once ignored. I did not go on book tour or attend readings. I did not want applause. I received letters from women I had never met, from widows, from mothers, from women who said they too had been quiet for too long. Some wrote of gardens, others of betrayal, most of solitude. None asked me to reply, but I did. Every single one. Not because I felt obligated, but because their words deserved to be acknowledged as mine had been. I wrote slowly in the mornings. After watering the garden, I would sit by the window with tea and respond to the world that had, unexpectedly, found me. The sun would trace its path across the floorboards, and I would let the light guide my pen. It became a rhythm of listening, and I realized that writing had never been about saying something important. It was about giving shape to the things we carry inside, the ones that threaten to vanish if we don't name them. One letter stood out. It came in a pale blue envelope, the handwriting tight but elegant. Inside was a single page. The name at the bottom read, Anna. She had written only a few lines. I saw your book. I wasn't sure if I should reach out. I've read it 3 times. I recognized myself in the spaces, in the restraint. Thank you for not making me a villain. You could have, and perhaps I was, but your grace is more than I deserved. I did not respond right away. I left her letter on my desk for weeks, letting it rest among bills and pressed leaves. Every time I passed it, something in me stirred, not with resentment but with something heavier, understanding. What a strange thing to be tied to someone by love and by loss, to be bound by a man who never fully belonged to either of us. I finally wrote back in the dead of winter. My hands were cold and the air sharp, but the words came easily. Lana, you weren't a villain, you were a mirror. And mirrors, as I've learned, do not lie. Thank you for seeing me. That's all I ever needed. Eleanor. I never received a reply. I did not expect one. What mattered was that something long frozen between us had quietly thawed. By spring, the lilies returned. The first buds peeked through the soil like shy survivors, and I greeted each of them by name. I spoke aloud to the garden, no longer embarrassed by the sound of my own voice. There is a strange freedom in knowing you have nothing left to lose, and perhaps even more in realizing you were never meant to lose yourself in the first place. Matthew called more often now. He asked how my writing was going, sent me articles, even debated the possibility of adapting my essays into a podcast. I smiled at the thought of my quiet words traveling through speakers into the lives of strangers. It seemed both absurd and beautiful. He asked if I had ever thought about dating again. I laughed, not out of shock, but out of the simplicity of the question. I told him I wasn't lonely. I had myself. I had the garden. I had the ghosts who no longer haunted but gently watched, and for the first time in my life that was enough. But one afternoon, I found myself sitting on the porch longer than usual. The wind carried the scent of rain, and with it, a memory I hadn't called for. It was a Sunday, years ago, when Robert returned early from one of his supposed business trips. He had brought home pastries, and for a moment I believed it was an ordinary gesture. But I noticed the crease of guilt in his eyes, the way he watched me from across the kitchen, too quiet, too careful. I remember pretending not to notice. I remember thanking him. And I remember how we sat together, saying nothing, eating sugar-glazed lies off delicate china. There are things we remember not because they mattered, but because we refused to feel them at the time. They wait for us. They always do. I wrote about that moment. I wrote it not to accuse, but to finally feel it. And in doing so, I found another truth. Forgiveness is not about them. It's about no longer needing their apology to be whole. That spring, I started a new journal. I titled it after, not for Robert, not for Anna, for me, for the version of me who now lived fully in the quiet aftermath of so much pretending. Each page was a step forward, not into a new life, but into the life I had delayed. Sometimes I walked to the edge of town, where the fields opened wide and the wind felt like a blessing. I no longer carried the necklace. I had given it to a women's shelter, hoping it might be sold for someone's fresh start. The letter I kept, not in a drawer but in a frame beside a small handwritten note of my own. This is not the end. It is the point from which I began again. Grief has a way of rearranging what we believe is important. In its wake, things we once clung to become dust, and things we overlooked begin to bloom. I often sat in the garden now with no book in hand, no task in mind. I simply sat and breathed and listened. Even silence, I discovered, has different tones. There is the silence of absence, which aches, the silence of understanding, which soothes, and then the silence of becoming, which sings so softly one must be still to hear it. It was during one of these garden afternoons, perhaps late May, that I received a call from a woman named Louise Temple. She introduced herself as a faculty member from a nearby community college. She had read my book, or rather, one of her students had brought it in, quoting it during a seminar on personal narrative. They had passed it around, and apparently my words had found a home there. She asked if I might consider speaking, not at a conference or large auditorium, just to a small circle of students who had been moved. I didn't answer her right away. I said I'd think about it, and I did, for nearly a week. It was not fear that held me back, but the memory of years spent unseen. To stand before others now, to speak where once I had only written, it felt like trespassing on a life I had forfeited long ago. But the thought of those students lingered, young voices seeking meaning. And so I said yes. When I arrived, I wore no makeup. I wore my gray hair pinned back simply, a long navy coat I'd owned for years. The room was warmer than expected, filled with folding chairs and the aroma of coffee and old wood. The students were younger than Matthew. They smiled but didn't chatter. They waited, and I spoke. Not of Robert, not of Anna, but of stillness, of the years we trade for silence, of how truth often comes not in lightning but in rain. I spoke of the drawer of forgotten writings, of the first time I wrote again. I told them that healing is not a flash of light. It is a slow kindling, a wick catching fire after years of wet wind. Afterward, one girl, Emily, came to me. She held my hands in hers and said, "You sound like my mother could have sounded if she hadn't been afraid. Thank you for not being afraid." And I wept, quietly, not for sorrow but for something like grace. In the following months, I was invited to speak again. Not often, just enough to remind me that voices don't age, only grow more certain. My world had widened in ways I had not planned for. I was no longer the woman who had stayed for her son. I was the woman who had stayed long enough to become someone her son admired. One morning, Matthew arrived unexpectedly. He brought with him a woman. Her name was Claire. She was gentle, thoughtful, and her eyes carried a kind of joy I hadn't seen in Robert's in years. Matthew looked at her the way young men do when they are no longer boys, without desperation, without hunger, but with reverence. He said nothing of engagement, but I could see it in his shoulders, in the way his gaze always found her, even in silence. They stayed the weekend. Claire helped me weed the garden. She asked about each plant by name, took notes, and said she wanted to try planting lilies herself. In the evenings, we sat by the fire pit and she asked me to read aloud from my journal. I declined at first, but eventually I did. Her eyes never left my face. Later that night, after they had gone to bed, I stood alone in the kitchen and made myself a cup of tea. I looked out the window at the moonlit yard and thought of Robert, of the man he had been, the man I had once believed in. I thought, not with sorrow, but with strange tenderness. He had never truly seen me, but through his failures I had found myself. Sometimes the gifts we receive are not wrapped in ribbons, but in ruin. The next day I wrote a letter to Anna, my first in over a year. I told her about the lilies, about the student named Emily, about Claire and how she smiled. I told her that I had begun again. I didn't mail it, but I left it in the journal. Perhaps one day it would find its way to her. There are truths we live with for so long they begin to feel like foundations. The truth of my marriage was one of them. For years I stood upon it, not realizing the floor had long since rotted through. I had mistaken endurance for strength, silence for peace. But in the quiet days that followed Matthew's visit, I began to understand something more difficult, more tender. Sometimes we only become ourselves after loss has stripped away all pretense. The journal where I had tucked Anna's reply and my own unwritten letters was full now. The pages held pieces of a woman I had once hoped to be, and finally, a woman I was proud to become. I did not erase my past, nor did I rewrite it. I simply gave it room to exist beside me, no longer behind me. This is, I believe, the closest thing to healing, when the past no longer haunts but hums. One morning, a knock came at my door. Claire stood there, cheeks flushed with spring air. She held a small envelope in her hand, her fingers trembling slightly. Her eyes shimmered with a kind of nervous joy I recognized instantly. It was the look of someone holding a secret just barely contained. She didn't say anything. She simply handed me the envelope, then hugged me with an urgency that felt like a thank you. Inside was a photograph, Claire and Matthew standing beneath a blossoming dogwood tree. A silver ring shimmered on her hand. The image was soft, glowing, a promise made visible. There was no formal letter, just a line written on the back. "We wanted you to be the first to know." And so I wept again. Not from grief this time, but from the profound grace of being included, not as obligation, but as honor. They asked me to speak at their wedding. "Just a few words," Claire said. "Whatever you want." I thought long about what I could say to a room full of people who might never know the woman I once was, the one who stayed silent for years, who folded dreams into linen drawers, who held a marriage together with threads thinner than breath. At the wedding, I wore the soft blue dress I had once bought for no occasion at all. My hair was pinned with a lily from the garden just beginning to open. When I stood to speak, I did not shake. I did not look down. I told them of the soil, of the seasons, of how sometimes love does not look like passion but like persistence. I told them that beginnings are not found in youth but in courage. And I ended with this: "May you never forget to look at each other, not just glance but truly see, because love is not about being needed, it is about being known." The applause was soft, respectful. Claire cried. Matthew nodded, eyes steady. In that moment I knew they had seen each other, and I at last had been seen too. In the months that followed, I received another letter from a publisher in New York. They wanted to republish Lilies in the Wind, this time for wider distribution. They called it A Voice for Women Who Have Lived in the Quiet. I signed the papers without fanfare, not because it wasn't meaningful, but because it no longer needed to define me. It was simply another bloom in a garden I had tended with care. Anna never wrote again. Perhaps she had moved on, or perhaps her silence was her own version of peace. I often wondered if she had planted anything since, if she had forgiven herself, if when she closed her eyes at night she could remember his face not with longing but with release. I hope she has. And as for Robert, I visit his grave once a year. I do not bring lilies. I bring rosemary for remembrance. I sit beside the headstone not to mourn but to speak. I tell him what Matthew is building. I tell him Claire's laugh could lift the sky. I tell him that I have learned how to write my name again, not as someone's wife or someone's mother, but simply as Eleanor. That is the name I had nearly forgotten, the name I now carry with grace. The gift Anna sent me, the letter, the necklace, the truth, was not the end of anything. It was the beginning, the unraveling that made space for something real, and though the world did not change, I did. In the quiet of each day I still write, not for acclaim, not for forgiveness, but for presence, because every word I put to page says I am here, I was here, I lived. And that I have come to understand is more than enough.